And then the first thing I'm going to put on the screen is our agenda. First of all, make sure everyone can hear me. Can you all just chime in to make sure that I know that you hear me?
I can hear you.
Okay.
I can hear you.
Okay, great. And Malkin said that he was going to be muted because he's got a bad cough. So he and I spoke earlier, so I'm going to assume that he can hear me. So first thing that you should be able to see is an agenda for this evening's meeting. Is that correct? Should say optional online meeting, February 5, 2020. And the first thing I want to do is just kind of do a brief overview of module 2.1, the reading assignments and assignments that you were supposed to do, just to make sure that everyone's on the same page with that. So in order to do that, I have to unshare. And okay, now you should be able to see the course desktop. And I'm just going to go into the module 1, or I'm sorry, module 2. And I'll go in. Okay. All right, so hopefully everyone had a chance to read the overview and instructions and the activities and assignments and their deadlines. You had basically 2 readings to do this time besides the initial overview and instructions. Not a whole lot of pages, about 11 pages in the textbook in Chapter 3. Chapter 3 is really long, and so I'm spreading it out over a couple of weeks because the information in Chapter 3 is really important because it has to do with searching databases and finding literature and then organizing that literature so that you can use it. And then the second reading was basically an EBP exemplar, or what the textbook authors call a success story. And I just assigned that because I think it contains a good example of how the EBP process is applied in a clinical setting. And then I had asked you to read the problem introduction or assignment instructions and post any questions about that you have in the questions discussion forum. And we can also entertain any questions this evening when we get to the end. And of course, tonight we're doing the lecture. For the discussion, you were supposed to read those problem introduction assignment instructions and then select your number 1 PICO question, one that you think is the highest priority in the practice setting or that you could use for a future assignments in this class or possibly your grad project proposal. And then you were supposed to consider the sources of internal evidence in the practice setting that you could use to describe the problem in its local context in that problem introduction assignment that's due on, I believe it's Sunday. And then you were supposed to use your literature search strategies to do a search to locate sources of external evidence about the clinical problem that inspired this PICO question. So that would be published evidence that you'd be looking for to describe the problem in its general context. And you'd be looking for those sources because you need that primary source published evidence to describe the problem in its general context in that first paragraph of the problem introduction assignment. And another reason that I wanted you to do this is because I wanted you just to search for evidence like you have done in the past, just how you normally do it, because I think your search techniques are going to change over the next couple of weeks as we move through Chapter 3 in the textbook. And then the other discussion, well, the other assignment or activity that you're supposed to do is identify a reference librarian and post a message about that in the Module 2 discussion forum. And I believe that was due by February 2nd. So everyone should have done that by now. And it's really important to find a reference librarian, and then when you do eventually meet with that reference librarian, you want to make sure that he or she knows the purpose of the meeting. The purpose of that meeting, that when you eventually meet with the reference librarian, is going to be to help you construct your search strategy based on the PICO question that you decide to work with for the remaining assignments in this course, and possibly your grad project. It's not going to be so that librarian can give you an orientation to the databases that are available to you, or to show you just the basics of searching. I want them to help you construct a search strategy, and to also help you identify the appropriate databases that you should search based on that search strategy. Now, for the literature search assignment that you will eventually do in this course, you're going to be required to search CINAHL and Medline, which are both accessible through Allen College's subscription to EBSCOhost. You can search other databases as appropriate, but at a minimum, I want you to search those two databases. Now, I know some institutions have Embase, and Embase is a database that actually covers Medline. So if you searched Embase, you would not have to also search Medline. Or if you search PubMed, you're basically searching Medline. In fact, you're going beyond Medline if you search PubMed. Okay, so that's kind of the overview of the upcoming, or the Module 2 discussion assignments. And then, of course, you're going to be doing the problem introduction assignment. And towards the end of the presentation tonight, I'm going to go into detail about the aspects of the problem introduction assignment. So I'm not going to spend much time on this item B2 here. Okay, then for announcements and reminders, oh, and ignore my times that I have on here. I forgot to change the times to reflect the fact that we are meeting an hour earlier this time, and unlike last time when we started at 5 o'clock. That online meeting availability survey that you did showed that the most people were available at 4 o'clock on Wednesday. So that's why I changed the time to an hour earlier. So getting back to item 2 on the agenda, announcements and reminders. I just wanted to say a couple of things about the questions discussion forum. And a lot of people have been asking questions, and really good questions, which I appreciate. And often what happens at the beginning of the semester is that people tend to submit questions to me by email that actually turn out to be good questions for the questions discussion forum. So my goal is to get people to actually post their question in the forum first before sending me an email. And I will honestly get to it just as fast as I would as if I were just answering it by email. Now, up to this point, I've been just answering people's questions via email. And, oh, I'm sorry, I want to switch back to the agenda here. As I was saying, up to this point, I've been just answering questions by email and then asking students to go ahead and post their question and my response in that questions discussion forum. But if I can get people to just initially post their question in the questions discussion forum, it will actually save a little time in the long run. So if you're asking a question that is not of a personal matter or a sensitive matter, and that it is something that your classmates might also have the same question or a similar question about, then the most efficient practice is to go into the questions forum and post it there. And I will, in most cases, answer it within 24 hours and 48 at the most. And if it's ever been 48 hours since you've posted a question during the business week and I haven't answered it, then send me an email and remind me that you've got a question in the questions forum that needs to be answered. And the next topic I want to talk about is discussion response subject lines. You will notice in the assignment instructions for discussion activities that I normally, I try to remember to specify a subject line. So like, for example, in the discussion 2.1, your subject line was to have been discussion 2.1. And then for the librarian discussion activity, your subject line is to be librarian. And the reason I specify the subject line is because I use that for sorting purposes. So like if I want to look at everyone's librarian postings, then I can sort, and all those librarian postings will group together. Now, if you add your name to the subject line or put other information in the subject line, it doesn't sort as neatly. So that's why I request that you use the subject line that I specify. And I believe in the instructions or the rubric for scholarship grading, one of the criterion is that you follow the instructions and that you have used the specified subject lines. So if I were to happen to randomly select a discussion posting for scholarship grading, you could possibly lose a little bit of points for not using a correct subject line. So just a reminder going forward to please use the specified subject line in your discussion posting. And if I ever don't specify a subject line, then you have the freedom to call the discussion posting whatever you want. But if I specify it, please use the specified discussion subject line so that I can sort the way I want to on those discussion postings. Okay, and then the next thing I want to discuss is use of abstracts in journal articles. We have an assignment coming up, and you'll be extracting information from journal articles to write your introduction of the problem in its general context. And I just want to point out that that information should come from the body of the article, not the abstract. It's fine to read the abstract. In fact, you should read the abstract, but you are not to quote or paraphrase from the abstract. You should be reading the full text of the article and getting the evidence from an appropriate place in the article itself, not from its abstract. And if any questions about that come up, we can talk about that more towards the end of the presentation, because we're actually going to be looking at some journal articles, because I want to point out sort of the moves that authors make when they are introducing a problem. Okay, so with that, I'm going to go ahead and bring up the presentation and get started on that. Any questions at this point before I go into the presentation?
Nope.
All right, hearing none, we'll go ahead. So I'm basically covering chapter 1 material, the first part, or I'm sorry, chapter 3 material, those pages 55 through 62. The first slide you see here is just basically a summary of the module objectives that will be covered or reflected in this presentation. And then, as I was saying, the content source is pages 55 through 66 in that chapter 3 of the textbook Evidence-Based Practice in Nursing and Healthcare. And we'll be continuing to read that chapter the next, I think in the next 2 modules. Okay. Something that is covered in that chapter 3 in the initial part is searching competencies. And you'll notice that some of the module objectives are specific searching competencies. And the one we're covering tonight is the first objective, which is basically to have a general understanding of the search competencies. But I'm hoping, that throughout this chapter and by the end of the course that you folks will have developed some basic competence with these searching competencies. So you've already are working on determining this. You've identified a PICO question, and the next thing we'll be doing is picking out the search terms from the PICO question. And that's going to be one thing that the reference librarian can advise you about. And then determine appropriate databases or sources to search. That's another thing that the reference librarian can advise on, given the knowledge that you're going to have going into that meeting with him or her. And then you need to be able to construct an appropriate search strategy, And then after you've done that and run your search, you're going to have sources, and then you'll need to be able to select appropriate sources of evidence to read. You'll need to organize the citations and your search strategy, because the search strategy you build, you want it to be something that you can use again and again to search different databases, to find evidence that's in those databases that may not be recoverable from other databases. And then lastly, you need to be able to obtain appropriate literature. Okay, this figure appears in your textbook. So it's figure 3.1 from page 56, I believe, of chapter 3. And it shows the suggested basic and advanced searching competencies. So what I just listed should reflect what's in blue here. These are the basic searching competencies that we're going to be working on throughout this course. If you were in a DNP program, then you might be working on the advanced competencies. Okay, so competency 3H is finding the right information to answer a given question often requires using more than one source of evidence, or this relates to that competency. So just thinking about searching for evidence, what are the possible consequences of using too few sources of evidence that you can think of? Just speak up when it comes to mind. Suppose you just search one database and you find one source.
Probably a little biased.
Exactly. Be biased, you wouldn't have covered maybe the range of evidence that might be out there. Anybody else have any response to that question?
One of the chapters for this last week said that the more evidence you have, the more confident you are with creating a suggestion.
Okay, sure. So the more evidence you have, the more confidence that you have in determining what practice should be. Is that what you meant?
Yeah.
Okay. All right. So I think you guys you're on the right track there. There might be other evidence out there, and that evidence that you didn't recover because you didn't search enough databases or you didn't gather enough sources might be stronger than the sources that you have. So what you need to do is you need the body of evidence. You need basically all of it in order to answer your PICO question, not just a single source. And that's why we learn to do systematic searches of the literature using electronic databases. All right, so then where should you search? That's a big question. And basically your textbook summarized in table 3.1, a lot of sources where you can search for evidence, basically sources where you can search for sources. And they've kind of summarized these sources by the type of application they are and whether you can access them without a subscription and if it costs anything to access them. So just glancing down through here, the Cochrane database of systematic reviews is one of the databases that's included in Allen College's subscription to EBSCOhost, and it is automatically selected. So if you search Allen College's subscription to EBSCOhost, the default databases that are going to be searched are going to be this Cochrane, the Cochrane databases, and let's see, Medline, CINAHL, and what else? Let's see. Whoops. Sorry, I didn't mean to stop sharing the slides. Allen College's subscription includes access to CINAHL, Medline, the Cochrane Central Registry of Clinical Trials, Cochrane Database of Systematic Reviews, and also the Cochrane Methodology database. So it's got a lot of I'm sorry about that. I keep misclicking. Okay. I believe also Allen College's subscription has, or to EBSCOhost has PsycInfo. It has access to PsycInfo, or maybe Psych articles. I'm not sure. So, there are other databases you can search through EBSCOhost at Allen College, but the ones that are, there's only a few that are checked by default. So when you go in there, you can click on choose databases and you can see which ones are already selected, and you can select others if you want to, or deselect some of the ones that are already selected. Okay. But you can see Embase, I believe, is a database that you can access through University of Iowa's resources, and it covers Medline. Let's see. And then just, there's a few more on the next page. These are, there's PsycInfo, and then you've got clinicaltrials.gov, Cochrane Central Registry, and then Google and Google Scholar are really internet search engines. Okay, so there's lots of places you can search, and you will have to, like for the assignments in this class, or for the literature search assignment, I'm only requiring that you search CINAHL and Medline. And as I said before, you can search other databases if you like, but I'm requiring that you search those too, because for most of your PICO questions, you're going to be able to find appropriate evidence by searching those databases. Okay. A few others that aren't mentioned on the table that we were just looking at. Cyverse, Science Direct. It gives you access to physical, engineering, health, life, and social sciences and humanities literature. And then Ovid's a pretty common one. It's an aggregated database that indexes other databases like Medline, MCare. I've seen, it just depends on your subscription to Ovid. I believe that it might also, depending on where you are accessing it, might provide access to CINAHL as well, and maybe PsycInfo or Psych articles. And then there's a ProQuest database, which Allen College also provides access to the ProQuest database. And it's a good avenue to access gray literature like theses and dissertations. Okay. Okay, and then there's the TRIP database, and I've never personally used TRIP, but it's really a search engine that was developed. It's developed and operated by a commercial company, but you can use it free of charge by going through this URL. You do have to register, and it apparently has a PICO search tool that you might find beneficial. But so if you've got a little extra time on your hands and you want to play around with the TRIP search engine, you could try that. Okay. These are just a list of databases for finding pre-appraised literature. What do you know what is meant by pre-appraised literature? Well, I'm kind of giving it away there by showing you these databases, I guess. So systematic reviews are a type of pre-appraised literature. Other types would be like evidence-based guidelines. Those evidence-based guidelines typically are built or created based on systematic searches and evaluation of literature. So in a sense, they're pre-appraised literature, but you can also access some pre-appraised literature, meaning that someone has already read the evidence and graded it or determined the strength of it, and perhaps summarized it to make it more easily accessible and usable to clinicians who are too busy to be spending time appraising evidence. And then there's also the DARE database, the peer database, and the ACP database. The only one of these that I've ever accessed is the Cochrane database of systematic reviews. Okay, these are some, well, this is just a comparison of licensed databases like CINAHL and is a licensed database. PsycInfo, Medline is the licensed database. Compared to internet search engines. It's easy, like, just to go in and search Google or Google Scholar, and in my experience, it's pretty productive. I tend to find really relevant sources at the top of the list, but I only do that when I'm in a hurry and I'm not being systematic and I'm not worried about capturing the body of evidence. When you want to capture a body of evidence, you really need to go about it systematically, whereas Google Scholar, it's kind of a shotgun approach. But anyway, with licensed databases like CINAHL, PsycInfo, and Medline, they list the journals that are indexed. So you know that when you search those databases, you know what journals are being searched. And if the list doesn't include the journals that you believe are going to have the literature that you're looking for, then you're probably going to want to search another database that does index those journals. Whereas internet search engines, I mean, they search the web, so they have a wide-reaching search capability, but it's uncertain as to what type of information is included in that search, or how the search engine thinks and goes about running the search using the terms that you provide. You can do a pretty refined search using Google and Google Scholar, because you can use Boolean search terms to do it. But most people tend to just throw some words in there, or they throw a question in the search field and let Google figure it out. And that it does have some utility. I mean, it's definitely not a negative thing to do, but it just shouldn't be the only way that you search. Okay, and internet search engines also capture gray literature. And I haven't really defined gray literature, but it's unpublished reports or conference proceedings, things that have not necessarily been peer reviewed. So as like a journal article is going to have been peer reviewed in most cases. So the gray literature is going to be stuff that hasn't probably gone through peer review. And like, as I was saying before, thesis and dissertations are considered gray literature, different types of white papers. Often, if a study is done and a report is written, if there were no statistically significant findings, the authors might not go on to publish the findings. And so their report becomes a form of gray literature. And you can see how, if you were wanting to systematically search and collect a body of evidence, if it omits gray literature, then it can tend to bias your search. Now, for you guys and the work that you're going to be doing in this class and moving on to the next class, NU536, it's not going to be expected that you reach into the gray literature unless there's so little literature about your to answer your PICO question that you are forced to do so. So you really don't need to worry about doing that. You may come across it anyway, and you may find it to be relevant and decide to include it. But definitely for this class, you're going to be required to work with a small number of sources for the assignments. And so I would expect that no one would need to use any gray literature. You'd be sticking with the peer-reviewed literature or literature from highly reputable and credible organizations. Okay, and the last bullet point here is that searching a licensed database or multiple licensed databases and using an internet search engine like Google or Google Scholar may be the most productive way to go. Now, for this class, I'm not going to require that you search Google or Google Scholar, because I want you to learn about using these licensed databases that the college and your organizations are going to permit access to. Okay, so just getting back to where you should search, it depends somewhat on the type of PICO question that you're asking. If your PICO question is an intervention question, then you're for sure going to want to search the Cochrane database of systematic reviews, because you'll want to see if there's been a review of the clinical trials that have been done to test that intervention. So that would definitely be one of the databases you'd search, but you'd also want to search beyond the database of systematic reviews, because after a systematic review is published, additional studies might be done to test an intervention, and they might not be included in that review. So you'd want to capture those individual studies that weren't included in the review that you find in the Cochrane database of systematic reviews. And incidentally, CINAHL and Medline both index Cochrane reviews. So if you're searching CINAHL and Medline, you're probably going to catch anything that's in the Cochrane database, but I'm not sure how the most up-to-date reviews would be found by searching the Cochrane database of systematic reviews, because there's going to be a time lag before CINAHL and Medline can get them indexed. And then just I'm mentioning incidentally here, the EBSCOhost and Ovid are both vendors of Medline. EBSCOhost also hosts CINAHL, and that lastly, Medline is part of PubMed. So some of the citations in PubMed are not in Medline, but if you search PubMed, then you are searching Medline basically. So if you do that, there's no point in also searching Medline, because essentially you're searching it by searching PubMed. And I think the same goes for Embase. Okay, so then what should you search for? Well, you need to search for evidence to answer your PICO question. But before we get to that point, what you've been doing in this module is just doing some searching on your own without any formal training, so to speak, of how to do a search, and you're looking for evidence to describe the problem in its general context, which is what's going to be expected in that problem introduction assignment that's coming up. So those are two main reasons that what you should search for. You want evidence in all cases, and there's two reasons. You might want it to answer your PICO question, and then you need some evidence to also describe the problem. And typically the evidence that you use to describe a problem is background evidence, whereas it's background evidence that answers background questions, the problem being part of a background question. And then I always have said that evidence to answer PICO questions is foreground evidence, because PICO questions are foreground questions, basically. So you need foreground evidence to answer PICO questions. Okay, and then this table was provided in your reading, and it's I think kind of helpful. It shows you the kind of in general the types of evidence that you would want ideally to answer specific types of PICO questions. So, and I think probably for the most part in the class, students tend to choose intervention PICO questions because they have a problem in a specific practice setting that can be remedied by changing practice in some way, and that practice change is a type of intervention. And so the strongest type of evidence to answer an intervention PICO question is going to be systematic reviews and meta-analyses, single randomized controlled trials, and then well-controlled non-randomized experimental studies, which would be like a quasi-experimental study. And then you can see prognosis questions are best answered with case control or cohort studies. Meaning questions are typically answered with qualitative evidence, meta-analyses of or single qualitative studies. And I think right here where they wrote meta-analyses, I think they meant to put meta-synthesis, because meta-analysis is usually a term that's used to describe synthesis of quantitative research, whereas meta-synthesis is a term used to describe the synthesis of qualitative studies. Okay. And then to answer background questions, you typically need descriptive studies. So what I'm hoping to see is that in your problem introduction assignments, the description of the general problem is supported with evidence from descriptive studies, possibly epidemiological studies, evidence from studies that have been done to describe the problem. And then lastly here, multiple intervention questions in one question, then it's probably going to be evidence-based clinical practice guidelines that you want. Whoops. Because those tend to answer multiple PICO questions within the guideline. Okay. All right. And then something very important, as you probably have gathered, because it was a specific activity in this particular module, is that it's essential that you collaborate with a librarian who is knowledgeable about evidence-based practice and knows appropriate databases to search and how to search those databases. And that it's essential because you need their assistance to build your search strategy and also to identify the best databases to search, or at least to get some advice on those databases. Okay. And then I just want to emphasize the importance of the problem as the driver for your PICO question. A really common issue that we run into with students when they're new, they're just learning about the evidence-based practice process, or they're getting reacquainted with it after having not been in school or having not used it for a while, is that they get enthusiastic about a solution to a problem, and they want to approach the PICO question from the point of the solution instead of the problem. And it's the most important thing is to identify a real problem in a practice setting, and then structure your PICO question to identify solutions to it. So just to reinforce that evidence-based practice is it's a process that's a strategy for dealing with clinical practice problems. It's those clinical problems, not the I part of the PICO question or the intervention, that leads to the PICO question. So don't put the cart, i.e. the solution, before the horse. So think of the horse as the problem, and it's being driven, or it's pulling the cart. So just to make sure you've got things in the right order and got your priorities straight. I know that it's interesting to, it's interesting to see like an important practice change or an interesting practice change that you would like to implement in your practice setting. But if you don't have a problem in that setting that warrants implementing that practice change, then it's really kind of a waste of your time to go through the EBP process. So there needs to first be evidence of a problem, and then you can start going in search of solutions. Okay, and I just want to go a bit over the problem introduction assignment. We're way early, so I do not think I'm going to have you here till 8 o'clock tonight, in case you were worried about spending that much time in this online meeting, because I'm almost to the end of the presentation here. So I just wanted to kind of reinforce a few points about the problem introduction assignment. And just to point out that academic and scholarly papers almost universally begin with an introduction. That's kind of a standard practice for any paper that you write. It begins with an introduction, and that introduction typically consists of a description of a problem. Okay, so it's a common feature of academic and scholarly papers that they begin with this introduction, and they begin by describing the problem that led to the need for the work then that they go on to describe in the paper. So with the problem introduction assignment, as you know, it starts with an introduction of the problem in its general context. And this is sort of beyond or above the project setting, or the clinical practice setting where perhaps you're working right now. The general context of the problem then leads to the description of that local problem, which is where you were or where you are, and where you noticed maybe a gap in practice, a problem with the way you're doing things in practice, that maybe there's that other institutions are doing it differently. That description of the local problem is going to lead then to your PICO question. Okay, So the general context is going to consist of external evidence. Okay, and that external evidence refers to in most all cases, published statistics, facts, and ideas that you get from primary sources. Okay, it's evidence that proves or supports the notion that there's a problem. And if you were the local, or excuse me, the general context should answer these following questions. What is the problem? Who does it affect? How often does it occur? How prevalent it is? And what are its consequences? Okay. And it's often the consequences of a problem that really drive home the fact that it is a problem, because the consequences, depending on how severe they are, provide you with information about the significance of that problem. Then the general context is going to provide background for the clinical problem in the local setting. And that's where we go next. So that local problem refers to what's happening in the local context that sparked your interest and inspired you to look for solutions. Okay, it's going to be internal evidence. All right, so what internal evidence of the problem do you have? Ask yourself that question. Ideally, it's sort of formal evidence that's been documented in internal reports, or it's evidence that exists in the electronic medical record that can be extracted and summarized in a report. But in a lot of cases, being practicing clinicians, you notice problems before the whole institution notices the problem. And so you might just have personal experiences and observations to go on for your internal evidence. And those can include, internal evidence can include verbal and written communication with colleagues, could be your department meeting minutes, it could be the results of QI or quality improvement activities, patient survey findings, and audit findings. Okay, so those are all, there's been a lot of questions this past few days about internal evidence. And I think one of the reasons is because the definition in this class has been broadened beyond what the definition is in the textbook. The textbook, you know, made it sound like internal evidence is just the results of quality improvement and evidence-based practice initiatives in the setting and electronic medical records data. But like, as I was saying, sometimes clinicians notice problems before they've been noticed or recognized by the institution. And so often there isn't any formal documented internal evidence. You just have to go on your anecdotal evidence or your personal experience. All right. So any questions about internal evidence at this point?
I had a question about the searches.
Uh-huh.
I've used Primo in the past for Allen, and it basically, from what I understand, searches all our databases. Is that something that you would use at all, or would you be more specific and use like EBSCO specifically separate and then Ovid, so on and so forth?
I would use Primo, but only after I had my search strategy built, because it's going to be put together, and you're going to have key terms and synonyms for those key terms, and you're going to have subject headings and mesh headings, and they're going to be connected in a logical way with Boolean operators like and or. And otherwise, I kind of consider Primo a little bit of a shotgun approach. It's effective, but you don't know if you're getting the body of evidence that way. So we're not going to really, Primo is not, it's basically a search engine. That's what I would call it, because it goes out and it searches our other resources that we have. But I want you guys to be able to construct a search strategy that you could perhaps then use to search Primo. And the search strategy, though, and it should be, you'll end up with a search strategy that you can use in multiple databases, because It's going to have the term, it's going to have all the terms that those databases should recognize, but it may have terms that they don't, in which case it'll just ignore those terms. But you'll make the search strategy you build will be an efficient one, because you will be able to take it from one database to the next, and it should capture the body of evidence for you.
Okay.
That's the idea. And I mean, if you're interested about Primo, I would definitely ask the medical librarian more about it. But for the assignments in this class, well, I take that back. For the problem introduction assignment, you could certainly have used Primo to search for evidence. But moving forward, like for the literature search assignment, again, just you're going to actually search CINAHL by itself, and you're going to search Medline or an equivalent by itself. Okay, and you should be able to use, you should be able to build search strategies that work for both. Okay.
I have a question on internal evidence as well.
Okay.
So if as part of our information for the problem introduction assignment is based on information from like chart audits and such, is there like a specific way to cite that, or can we just like describe that? What's the best approach?
I think I answered that question today in the questions discussion forum.
Oh, okay.
It might have been my reply to Malkin. In his reply, I think the thread is titled just internal evidence, and there's several replies to it, but I think I covered that. I covered, I believe you would cite that as personal communication.
Okay.
And I'm not exactly sure how, because I didn't get any guidance from the APA manual. The APA manual, like the only examples of citing personal communication it provided were as if you had spoken to someone. But I know like email correspondence and something like an audit report, any sort of internal report like that that would not be accessible to the general public or your audience for your paper, you would cite it as personal communication. And I think in that reply, I gave examples of how you might, I think it was meeting minutes, maybe, how you would maybe cite those as personal communication. And you could probably translate that into an audit report.
Great, thank you.
Yeah, and you wouldn't, any personal communication, then you don't have a reference list entry for that.
Okay.
It's evident in the body of the paper.
Okay.
All right. Any other questions about internal evidence? And I think what we're going to do is take a break and then come back, and I want to go through these examples of problem introductions. I located a lot of journal articles and just want to show you how sort of the moves that the authors make as they're introducing the problem at the beginning of the journal article. So let's take like, let's actually, what time? 4:49, yeah. So let's take like a 10-minute break. Does that work for everyone? So let's be back at 4:59. And I'm just going to pause the recording.